So I'm Dr. Liz Eckelkamp. I'm the Dairy Extension Specialist at the University of Tennessee, and I am joined by a wonderful group of experts who will be talking tonight. Y'all do not have to listen to me. Y'all are quite lucky. We'll be hearing first from Dr. Sean Hawkins. He is in the Biosystems and Ag Engineering Department, and his specialty tonight will be using animal manure as fertilizer. We also have Dr. Lori Duncan, who is also in BESS, and she'll be talking about precision application of fertilizers. Dr. Aaron Smith, who is in the AREC department, which is Agriculture and Resource Economics. I always say it wrong. Got it right that time. He'll be talking to us about the future outlook of fertilizers and how long we can expect these high prices to continue. And then Dr. Neil Esch, also in, are you in BESS or are you in plant sciences? BESS. And he is a soil health expert. And just some quick housekeeping for those of you who need Master Dairy, Master Beef, or Master Row Crop credit. This meeting will count towards all of those objectives. So make sure you clicked Master Beef or Master Dairy in your registration. Master Row Crop is not on there, but let Lori or myself or Courtney know, and we'll make sure to get you in the right spot. All you have to do is prove you were at the meeting and you registered. So you did that. All right, without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Hawkins. The rest of us are going to go ahead and turn our cameras off so we don't break your bandwidth, because we do know we have some people joining us from rural counties. So if you'll have any questions, feel free to throw them in the chat or in the Q&A, and we'll get to them as they go. All right, Sean, whenever you're ready.
Okay, can everybody hear me? Great. And you can see my screen? I'm assuming so. So tonight, first off, I'm Sean Hawkins. As Liz said, I'm in the Biosystems Engineering and Soil Science Department. And I do quite a bit of research with animal waste and also biosolids and other waste as alternative fertilizers to produce crops and forages. So tonight, I'm going to give you an overview of some of the research that I've been doing for the last several years. I'm going to cover a lot of material. So everyone hopefully is aware that we're going to record the presentation. So if you have some interest in a graph that I don't spend a whole lot of time on, and maybe you want to go back and see it, then you can go back to the recording and you should be able to spend more time on it and maybe see the point I was trying to make about it. So I do have my cell phone number here. I give that out freely to agents and producers. If you have any questions, of course, you can call that number. Okay, so the first thing I want to do is just kind of go over an introduction. The first things first, it's something I always do in my presentations. Before I go into any detail, we want to talk about what we need to do first before we consider using alternative fertilizers. And then I'm going to talk about the common alternative fertilizers that are available in Tennessee, and I'll show you some of the research that I've conducted with them over the last several years. First things first is, as with any fertilizer, whether it's a chemical fertilizer or an alternative fertilizer, whether it's animal waste or biosolids or some other industrial residue, these are the things that are really required for you, to do your planning properly, before you consider, using an alternative fertilizer. And you would do this anyway, even with a chemical fertilizer. You have to start with a soil test. When we talk about alternative fertilizers, one of the critical things that we want to be considering is whether or not we need phosphorus and potassium to produce our crop, particularly this year. So that soil test is really important this year when fertilizer costs are so high. It also establishes the value of these fertilizers. So that's important to begin with. You need a test of the fertilizer material. So if you are fortunate enough to be able to acquire some broiler litter, poultry manure, perhaps some breeder waste or biosolids from a wastewater treatment plant, you need a test analysis of that material to establish the rate that you're going to apply it at. And this form that I have over here on the right, I'm going to show you several publications that I have this form in. It's basically how to take this information, the soil test and the alternative fertilizer, and figure out what your land application rate should be. Obviously, we want you to establish the need for fertilizer based on UT Extension's published fertilizer recommendations rate. We spend a tremendous amount of time verifying those rates for nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium with various crops. It's a wealth of information, so you can take advantage of that. And then there's also things in this sheet that you might want to consider, like field nitrogen credits, whether it's for past manure applications or soybeans or other legumes. That's something to consider. And then one of the big factors that you need to consider with alternative fertilizers is nitrogen availability. It's not 100% available typically in these organic fertilizers, so that's something that you really have to, that you have to consider. And oftentimes with chemical fertilizers, we can have a custom blend of exactly what we want, and that's not the case with alternative fertilizers. Any organic material is you're going to get what you get. It's not a balanced fertilizer. So oftentimes, I find that, when we do figure our rates, there may be some supplemental nutrients that are still required, and you would have to be knowledgeable of those and make sure that you apply them to make sure that your crop is successful if you use one of these alternative fertilizers. These are 3 publications that have these worksheets in it. I'm not going to go over a lot of the dairy and the swine waste research that I've done. I think that most people have access to broiler litter and also breeder waste and biosolids. The guys that are dairy producers, of course, they're going to be using their own dairy manure, particularly this year. So most of the data that I present is going to be on litter and biosolids, but you should keep in mind that anything that I discussed today is applicable to swine and dairy waste and beef waste also. So let's talk about poultry litter availability first. This is a map of Tennessee, and it shows 2 different types of poultry companies. They're the integrated broiler companies. These are the guys that go out and secure a contract, for example, to supply Chick-fil-A with breast meat, or perhaps Kroger. And then you have the primary breeders. The vast majority of the waste is associated with these guys here, the integrated broiler producers. And these circles that I've drawn here basically is the counties where you're going to be able to obtain broiler litter, at a reasonable cost. In West Tennessee, that's going to be in Weakley County, Gibson, Obion, Dyer, Carroll, and Henry counties. In South Central Tennessee, it's mainly going to be in Bedford County in particular. That's our 2nd leading poultry producer county. Marshall County, Lincoln, and Franklin. We've got quite a few breeder operations in Wayne, Lawrence, and Giles. And then in Southeast Tennessee, we have 2 processing plants in Chattanooga. Bradley County is our leading poultry producing county in the state. And then North Central, we have Tyson Foods, that's in Mayfield, Kentucky, Albany, Kentucky. And most of those houses, along with the Cobb Bantress houses, are in Sumner, Macon, Clay, Overton, and Fentress County. And then we have a few still left in Jefferson County and Sevier County. So that's where mainly you're going to be able to access broiler litter as an alternative fertilizer. Not to say that you can't get it in other counties, you certainly can. This is a generalization. Most broiler litter is about a 3-3-3 fertilizer, meaning it has 60 pounds of nitrogen, 60 pounds of P2O5, and 60 pounds of K2O. It's very easy to remember. The vast majority of the tests that I've done over the years, and I've been doing it for 15 years, lie somewhere between 40 and I would say 75 pounds for each of these nutrients, and that varies somewhat with the moisture content of the material. So litter management does vary from farm to farm, so you definitely want to do an analysis of the litter. So ask for that when you buy it. The critical thing, again, emphasizing this throughout the presentation, is that the nitrogen in these organic materials is not 100% available. You have to establish that with agronomic tests like what I'm going to show you. So it's largely organic and slow release. That means that for an alternative fertilizer, most of the nitrogen is going to be in organic compounds, and it has to be broken down by bacteria in the soil. So it's a very important consideration, particularly for an intensive crop like corn, for example. It's something that you have to carefully plan around. I want to give everyone here tonight, a good appreciation for the scale of poultry production in Tennessee. These figures right here are based on calculations that I've done with 2019 production data for corn and soybeans, wheat and cotton in these Northwest Tennessee counties, Obion, Gibson, Weakley, Dyer, Carroll, Crockett, Henry, and Madison. These counties are going to host the majority of the broiler houses for the new facility that's going in Humboldt, Tennessee. And if we look at the crop removal for all of those crops across all those counties, it's about 68.4 million pounds of P2O5 and 83 million pounds of potash that we remove whenever we harvest corn and soybeans in these counties. The litter that's going to be produced by the two processing plants, the one in Union City and the new one in Humboldt, will supply about 15% of the phosphorus and the potash that is removed currently in all of the corn, soybeans, wheat, and cotton that are harvested in these counties. And if we put a multiplier on that for today's value of these nutrients, it's substantial. So there is quite a bit of litter available not just in West Tennessee and South Central Tennessee and East Tennessee. And I don't think a lot of people appreciate the scale of the production for poultry. A couple of other facts down here is very interesting. The poultry feed demand in this area is 24.3 million bushels for corn and 8.7 million bushels for soybeans. Poultry feed is about 65% corn and 25% soybeans. That's 33% of all of the corn and soybeans that we produce in these houses that are going to be in these host counties that I'm showing here. Last thing point I'll make is that the nitrogen that's going to be present in the litter that's produced would be enough to supply all of the starter nitrogen for about 15% of the corn produced in these counties. So it's substantial. It's an important part of crop agronomics, especially in Northwest Tennessee. Excuse me. The other thing that we're going to focus on today is biosolids. I can't give you a generalization for the nutrient content in biosolids. It varies quite a bit. Excuse me. From processing plant to wastewater treatment plant to wastewater treatment plant. But I do want to give you an idea of what this product is. It's basically the leftover solids from wastewater treatment plants. And most folks think that it's human waste that's just simply collected from the wastewater treatment plant and then made available to land apply, and that's not the case. The solids are mainly made up of bacteria that are employed in these wastewater treatment plants to degrade wastewater. So that's what majority of the biosolids are. And when we use that term biosolids, it's important to know that this is a treated product. These are very strictly regulated products. So it's been treated to reduce pathogens and vector attractiveness for things like flies, for example. Moisture reduction is an important part of the treatment process. So it's not human waste. It's the solids from, basically the aerobic reactors in the plant. So that's mainly what it is. There's different types, Class B and Class A. For the bee producers that are on tonight, the Class B does carry a 30-day grazing restriction. That's something to be aware of. We do have more and more EQ biosolids. That's exceptional quality biosolids. They have no land application restrictions because they've been treated to the point where basically they could be sold in Lowe's or Home Depot. They're available all over. I've just got some figures here. There's 20,000 dry tons that are produced by Nashville Metro at their plant every year. I've got some research data on that product. 30,000 tons here in Knoxville and 55,000 tons in Chattanooga. So, a fairly substantial amount of material, not as much as as what we would have for litter products from poultry houses, but it's substantial. Okay, so now I'm going to transition into some of the litter research data that I've been conducting over the past several years. This is a picture here of myelin, and in the center where you see the corn that's being grown, that has different shades of green. That's basically where we're doing our plots, and we're adding different rates of poultry litter and looking at yield. So we're going to go into first talking about corn. In my opinion, corn is the ideal crop to be grown with litter as a fertilizer. There's several reasons for this. Number one, we split the nitrogen application rates for corn. So if I can move my Zoom box here, you see that for any yield goal above 126 bushels an acre, what UT Extension recommends is that you put basically 1/3 of your total fertilizer that's recommended on at planting, and you follow that up with 2/3 of the application at D6 when basically 6 of the leaves are showing collars. So this creates an ideal scenario for using litter, in my opinion, because that 1/3 at planting, the intent there is to reduce the risk for nitrogen losses. So, and it's possible to do that because we have, very low potential for yield impact for corn, in the first 3 or 4 or 5 weeks of growth. So that's an ideal scenario. We already know that our alternative fertilizer, the litter, the nitrogen is not completely, it's not all going to be available. So that's a good scenario. And then whenever we do have a higher risk for yield impact and a low risk for nitrogen loss, that's when we typically would apply our commercial fertilizer. So I think that's favorable. The other thing that's favorable is the nitrogen uptake rate for corn. This just shows you, this is the growth stages here on the bottom of the graph, and it just shows over time how much nitrogen is being taken up and also where that nitrogen is going in the plant. There's low demand after planting up to V6. High demand can be as high as 5 or 6, 7 or 8 pounds of nitrogen a day from V8 to tasseling, and then low demand, once we reach the reproductive stages. So ideal. This is data that I've collected over the last 3 years at Milan. In this study, what I'm showing is a negative control, which received phosphorus and potassium and sulfur, but it's not received nitrogen. A positive control, which was fertilized with 210 pounds of nitrogen. That application was split at planting in V6. And then I have different application rates of broiler litter that I've applied 2, 3, 4, and 7 tons an acre. There were no additional fertilizers of any kind used to produce this corn. So no nitrogen, no phosphorus, potassium, sulfur, boron, nothing was added. And what you see is that as we increase the rate at which we're applying the litter, the yields increase for the corn, but it never reaches the yield potential that we have for our positive control, except in year 2021. This past year, we actually yielded higher on average in the littered plots than we did the positive control, but that's an unusual result, and that's a very high rate. So the point being here is that it's very difficult to produce this crop with just litter. And any crop, for example, Bermuda as a forage, anything that demands a tremendous amount of nitrogen, you can't supply all of the nitrogen needs with litter or really any alternative fertilizer. So the strategy should be to pick out what portion of the nitrogen you can safely supply with an alternative fertilizer, and then focus on the phosphorus and potassium and perhaps sulfur and other perhaps micronutrient that you might be addressing with fertilizers. That's the better strategy, in my opinion, for using these alternative fertilizers. But part of the reason to show you this data is to show you that the material works. As we increase our application rates, obviously our yields are improving. So then the question is, why in 2019 and 20 and 21 for our lower rates of litter, why did we not yield as high as we did with our positive control? One of the things that we've done in these tests is we've collected ear leaves at R1, at silking basically, and we've examined the nitrogen content in those leaves, and we compared those with standards. And what you see, for example, in 2019, you see that the 2, the 3, the 4, and the 7-ton rates of litter, all the ear leaves from those plots had nitrogen in the low range. So what's driving those lower yields is the fact that the nitrogen is not releasing from this alternative fertilizer, and it's hindering yield. And the yield in 2021, you can see that the same thing happened again. And for the plot where we had the very high yields, you can see that the nitrogen content of the ear leaves was in a sufficient range. Now, we started a new study in 2021 that's different than this one. This is the results of that study. And basically what we do at planting, we put out 3 tons of litter, or we put out phosphorus and potassium based on soil tests. And we also add sulfur because we have a past history of deficiency of sulfur at this farm. And we basically, for each of those 2 different planting treatments, we come back at V6 and we apply different rates of chemical fertilizer. And what this shows is that the litter works just fine as a fertilizer to provide starter nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium and sulfur at planting. All of the different V6 application rates, if you look at the 3-ton litter rate and then the chemical fertilizer rate, they're all the same. They share the same letters. So what that means is that in this scenario where we're following the litter application with chemical nitrogen fertilizer, we get exactly the yield that we expect. So I think this is a better strategy. Just real briefly, why is that? If you look at the 100, the 130, and 160 pound rates that we applied, all of those, the ear leaves have nitrogen contents that are in the sufficient range. So in other words, we've made sure even with that lower rate of litter that we provided enough nitrogen to maximize yield. Real quickly, I know this is a complicated plot, but the black dots are basically, what we yielded with our chemical fertilizer. The red dots are what we yielded with our litter. And this plot allows me to estimate how much of the nitrogen became available from the litter this past year. And it was 55% at Milan in 2021. So again, not all of it is going to be available. That's a really important point to take home tonight. That's definitely a take-home message. Not all of the nitrogen is available. One of the ways that I'd like to see some of these alternative fertilizers used, as be biosolids or other industrial waste or litter, is to use them in a scenario where we have crop rotation. So the study that we've been conducting at Milan and Spring Hill, we've been following our corn with soybeans. We don't add any litter onto the soybeans. And then we look at the yields, and we also look at the trifoliate leaf micronutrient and primary nutrient and nitrogen content, and we compare them, and we try to see and judge whether or not the litter is perhaps helping, or in some instances, I have had producers ask me if it would harm soybeans. I'm not sure the mechanism there, but this is just data that shows you that for all of these treatments, when we had a prior year application of litter, we get the same yield that we do with our negative and positive controls. So litter is not necessarily going to help a soybean yield when it's grown in a year following a litter application, but it certainly doesn't hurt. I'm not presenting the direct application data that we have for litter on soybeans. We have done some of those tests, and in 1 year we did have a yield improvement. We have not been able to reproduce that this past year. So, and of course the soybeans don't require nitrogen. So it's hard for me to make sense out of going out and purchasing an alternative fertilizer and then just wasting one of the nutrients. So at this point, we're not recommending that you apply litter to soybeans for that reason. One thing to keep in mind with these crop rotations is that every time we harvest corn and soybeans, of course, we remove mineral nutrients. I'm just showing the phosphorus results here, but we have these results across several of the different mineral nutrients. And you can see that the removal rates for the positive control here for the corn is quite high, over 100 pounds of P2O5 an acre in 2019, and right at 100 pounds of P2O5 an acre in 2021. And then the soybeans that were grown in between are removing 75 pounds. So one of the key benefits in using an alternative fertilizer, particularly litter or biosolids, typically the phosphorus content is high. So when we apply litter in a crop rotation like this, if we apply it just to corn, we get enough mineral nutrients to carry us through 2, 3, 4, maybe even 5 years for crop removal of phosphorus or potassium. And so we have the long-term benefits from the mineral content of these alternative fertilizers, just driving home that point. And then just to make sure everyone, make a believer out of everyone, what we've done here is, this is just soil test phosphorus data. So you can see that I've got a low concentration below the red line, a medium concentration below the green line, and then it's high and very high. And this is soil test of the plot area where we grew the corn before we put the litter out. And then that's in 2019. And in 2020, what you see is this stair-step effect of the soil phosphorus concentrations increasing as the different application rates of litter increase. So it's higher from 2 to 3 to 4 to 7 tons an acre. And we see that in 2021 for the 4 and the 7 ton rate, those are equivalent, based on the statistical analysis of the data. We see that this increase in soil phosphorus is durable even after harvesting 2 crops. So, and I have similar data for potassium, of course, but I just don't have time to share that. One thing that's not been a success story for us is we have tried to produce cotton with litter. The performance has been pretty poor. This is the results that we got for 2019. Of course, the cotton nitrogen demand is not nearly as high as it is for corn. and timing is very important. One of the problems with litter and other alternative fertilizers, they're bulky. So the only practical way to apply them is to apply them at planting. Otherwise, if the crop is standing, then you risk, damaging the standing crop. So nitrogen timing is very important with cotton. So we've not found that using litter, it's not performed very well. This is just 1 year of results. In other years, we've had overvegetative growth of the litter, cotton grown with litter, where too much of the nitrogen is released. So I'm not ready to say yet exactly how we can use litter on cotton. The performance has really just not been that good. Okay, so now I'm going to switch from row crops to forages. So all of this research was done with both litter and biosolids, and it was completed in Greenville and Crossville. So at the Plateau Research and Education Center in Greenville also, we used mixed swards of grass. And basically this graph here shows 3 years of results. And the x-axis shows litter application rates over on the left at 2 and 4 tons an acre. Then this EQ, that's the biosolids from Nashville that we tested at 4 different rates: 3/4 of a ton, 1 ton, 1.5, and 3 tons an acre. And then we're comparing those treatments of those alternative fertilizers to our UT extension recommendations, which is 60 pounds of nitrogen in the spring and the fall, and then P&K according to a soil test. And we also have a negative control and a producer practice, which is 300 pounds of triple 19. So the important point of the graph here is that if you look at the yield for the littered plots and the higher application rates of the biosolids plot, they're no different than our UT extension recommendations in which we used commercial fertilizer. So this again hammers home that point that we can get equivalent yields with these alternative fertilizers if we plan properly, as we do with chemical fertilizers. And in fact, in some years, we actually get higher yields depending on the application rate. So in each of these applications, the litter at both 2 and 4 tons an acre produced more hay than the negative control. So it's working well as an alternative fertilizer. Going back to that point of the nitrogen availability, that's something I'm really trying to hammer home about these alternative fertilizers. Here I've got the graph of 3 years of results at Greenville and also at Plateau, and you can see that the nitrogen availability varies from year to year, and it varies from site to site. And the reason for this is that temperatures vary, soil temperature, precipitation, past uses of the areas impact litter nitrogen availability. So the point here is that when we do apply these alternative fertilizers, if we say, for example, that the litter is 45% available, in some years it may not be 45% available. It may be only 31% available. And in other years, it may be 55% available. So I think that going back to the point I made about the corn is you kind of got to use these fertilizers knowing that not all of that nitrogen may be available. So you kind of pick your crops with that in mind. One thing that's going to be obvious if you do use biosolids, I'm going to switch this next graph to biosolids nitrogen availability, and the immediate thing that you notice is that it's lower. This is almost always the case with biosolids. It's a highly treated product. So much of the organic matter is resistant to decay. So what we often see with biosolids is that the nitrogen availability will be lower than it is for litter. Litter, 50% availability would be a good rule of thumb. It was 45% on average in these results for the litter, and the biosolids was 32%. So if you do use a biosolids product, that's something to keep in mind, is that the nitrogen availability will tend to be lower than maybe some other products that you're used to using. I often get questions about crop quality. I didn't show any of the corn and soybeans data, in terms of protein content, but this graph here serves to make that point with the hay that we harvested. The crude protein content, was just fine with these alternative fertilizers. And in fact, if you look at year 2 in this study, you see that the highest rates of the biosolids, the EQ at 3 tons an acre, actually had a good bit higher crude protein content than our UT extension positive control. So I don't think that the quality of the forage or hay or the grain crop that you're producing is really an issue with these alternative fertilizers, so long as you plan well. I didn't show the data for the corn and soybeans, but it's obvious that the sulfur in litter is plant available and also in biosolids. We consistently see this in plant tissue and also actually in the grain. As our application rate increases for our alternative fertilizers, the sulfur content tends to increase. The last thing I want to do is just present to you, this is not something I can go over in detail, but I want to make everyone on the presentation that's viewing tonight aware of this. I have a nice calculator to calculate the value of litter and biosolids, and this basically, the trick here is just basically to know what your costs are, what fertilizer you're using, the nitrogen content of it, and then just assigning value to the phosphorus and potassium and the nitrogen that's available in your alternative fertilizer. So if anyone is interested in me running this tool for them or sharing this tool with you, I'm more than happy to do that so that you can understand whether or not you're getting a good value. This is actually the results I've got for litter. I know I've been aware that litter is available in some locations for $50 a ton. I know approximately what the analysis is. So the value of it is well more than $50 a ton. And I also know what some of the biosolids products are worth. They're actually at a premium. And you can see that for the biosolids product, our value minus the cost is actually negative. So that would be something to consider. You want to very carefully consider your analysis of these materials and then calculate the value of that alternative fertilizer based on the current cost of conventional fertilizers. Take home messages: establish your nutrient needs. More than anything else, what establishes the value of these alternative fertilizers is the soil test result. All of these organic fertilizers are going to be chock full of phosphorus and potassium, but if you don't need the phosphorus and potassium, then in my opinion, it's hard to justify using them. And then the crop nitrogen need, go to our UT extension fertilizer recommendations and follow those recommendations. Those two things right there really establish the value of these alternative fertilizers. Nitrogen availability is a critical issue. It's never 100% with organic fertilizers, so it's something to consider carefully. My goal in presenting a lot of this detailed data tonight, which I know I went through rapidly, but it's to convince you that these fertilizers, these alternative fertilizers work, and they work well. The hay yields and corn yields that we're able to obtain with litter and biosolids are equivalent to what we can obtain with commercial fertilizer, and the crop quality is just as good. I didn't show a lot of data on this point because I just simply don't have time, but there is extended value in these fertilizers. They do have plant available sulfur and zinc and copper and boron. That's something to keep in mind. And then I'd say the last thing I want to end with is if you do use these fertilizers, you need to make sure that you're using a soil test every 1 or 2 or 3 years because you can get rapid buildup of phosphorus and potassium in your soils, and that can create forage quality problems, grass tetany issues, for example, and it can lead to a situation where we have very high phosphorus concentrations in our soils, and that's a water quality problem. I just want to acknowledge the funding for the work that I presented tonight and all the folks that's helped me do the work. And then this is my contact information. This is my email address and phone number. Contact me at either my cell number or my email address if you have any questions. So that is it.
Thanks, Sean. I think you were right on time with me eating into it during the intro. So in the interest of time for all of our participants, if you have any questions for Sean, please put them in the Q&A or put them in the chat. And we're going to go ahead and, okay, what's the time frame on availability of P and K with litter versus commercial?
Generally, what we assume is that the P and the K in litter is 100% available. In some universities, you'll see that the estimate is 80 or 90%, but I've been doing test with these materials now, litter and biosolids both, for over a decade. And even on soils where we have a need for phosphorus and potassium, I've never seen an instance where we used the products and, we had deficiency issues, purpling, for example, in corn. I've never seen that issue. So it appears to me, and the conventional wisdom is that the phosphorus and potassium are readily available during the crop year.
Thanks, Sean. If anyone has any other questions, feel free to put them in the chat or into the Q&A. And Sean, if you can answer them in the chat and the Q&A, we'll go ahead and keep rolling. And we'll try to revisit any of them at the end of the meeting. But definitely ask your questions while we have them. It is great to take advantage of the expertise. We appreciate your time, Sean. All right, Lori.
All right, thanks. So I'm Lori Duncan. I am in the Biosystems Engineering and Soil Science Department as well, just like Dr. Hawkins. So Liz asked me to come talk about precision fertilizer application this evening. I'm sorry if you hear my kids in the background. They're hopefully in the bath right now, so we might hear some screams in a minute. Now my computer's not going to. There we go. So why are we talking about precision fertilizer? I'm sure all four of us are going to have background here, so I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time. Obviously, profitability is a big question mark this year. I come at this from a little bit different perspective. So I am an ag engineer. I'm not an agronomist, and my specialty area is on sustainability. So I've worked for the last 10 years on how we can actually, maximize our nutrient use efficiencies, in looking at measurements of reducing that environmental impact. So again, I'm not going to spend a lot of time. Aaron, Dr. Smith is right after me, but just looking at the 2021 UT crop budgets, we're looking at variable costs on this graph for corn, cotton, and soybeans. In the orange is the fertilizer cost that we have in our crop budgets for last year. And so I have it on the same scale. If we look at 2022, this is what Dr. Smith has put in our crop budget. So obviously, a significant portion of our budget this year is in fertilizer. Again, environmental considerations. Many of you have probably seen these maps before and heard about the hypoxia in the Gulf of Mexico. Tennessee ranks 7th in the states that contribute nitrogen and phosphorus to the Gulf of Mexico. So back in 2011, the states that border the Mississippi River were asked to make nutrient reduction strategies, and we've done that in Tennessee. You can see the partners there at the bottom that are involved in this effort. So we do have a voluntary nutrient reduction strategy in Tennessee to try to increase our nutrient use efficiency. And we're not talking just ag land, we're trying to reduce nutrients from urban, suburban, wastewater treatment plants, et cetera. But of course, agriculture is a big part of this. And then the last thing environmentally I want to mention is there is a lawsuit right now from the Sierra Club to the EPA trying to make basically numeric water quality criteria in the Ohio River Basin. So that will include Tennessee. If the EPA, which way they decide, we'll see. But of course, the Ohio River has had many issues in the last 5 to 10 years with their drinking water. So that's where that lawsuit's coming from. Of course, we all want to avoid regulations, and we like the voluntary framework much better, but we also have to play our part in reducing our offsite movement of nutrients. So the next question is, what do you mean by precision fertilizer? So of course, I always think variable rate application of fertilizers, and we'll talk about that. But I also wanted to mention, some other ways we can think about precision fertilizer application. So we're going to look and we're going to walk through source, timing, rate, and placement. And I've got just a few slides for source and timing here. Sean just did a great job covering some organic nitrogen sources, litter manure, biosolids. Obviously, those are much cheaper than commercial fertilizer this year, last year. Hopefully, Dr. Smith will tell us that we're not going to be seeing these prices in 2023. But we do need to look at the nitrogen availability for those, like Sean mentioned, and the timing of when that nitrogen will be available. Commercial nitrogen, we need to consider losses, placement. If we can ban fertilizers, we'll be a lot better off. And then nitrogen stabilizers. So we have a new soil fertility specialist at UT. He's based in Jackson, and he's kind of pulling together some of the data on nitrogen stabilizers. So we've seen Agritane be successful over the last decade, and now he's looking at, this is looking at Anvil, if anybody's familiar with that product. So we're looking at ammonia loss on the y-axis and days after application on the x-axis. So it's interesting to note that that top red bar was broadcast urea, and that bottom pinkish line was broadcast urea with Anvil. So we're seeing some good success with that product, and again with Agritane. So if we want to minimize our volatilization and really increase our nutrient use efficiency with the commercial end, then those products are really helpful. And then legumes, I just want to mention this. Obviously in row crops, we're looking at using winter cover crops, not just for the potential for some nitrogen, but also many other benefits, including weed suppression. So I pulled a little bit of data out of this cover crop variety test in Tennessee. It is on UT Crops under the variety trials. If you're interested in looking at the full set of data, there's a lot there. But Dr. Virginia Sykes has looked at many different species and combinations of species, and the nitrogen that we could expect from those. So she looks at planting and termination dates. I've included that here. And you can see on the far column, we're looking at terminating that winter cover crop May the 1st versus the next column over April the 1st. So all that data is available if you're interested in looking at that. I've had a lot of questions this past year about pastures and hayfields, and I primarily work with row crops. So I've talked with Dr. Gary Bates quite a bit, and he's given me some guidance. So he's saying add clovers to pastures and hay ground. You can see the seeding rates there for white and red clover, broadcasting at the end of February. And then once it's established, he's saying replace up to 60 pounds. We struggle to see that much in our winter cover crops for row crop production, but I would think you could expect, maybe 30 pounds. So that is an option for source of nitrogen. Looking at timing, split and delayed application. Again, this is from Dr. Bates, but with pastures, instead of putting out 60 pounds in one shot, split that. So apply 30 pounds early spring, another 30 pounds mid to late spring, just to increase the efficiency and decrease your losses. With hayfields, he's suggesting wait until early April. That a lot of people are trying to put it out in March and trying to force that green up, but he was seeing a lot of losses when we did that. So delaying that application. Sean mentioned this in his presentation, but we do recommend split application of nitrogen on corn for anything above, I think, 125 pounds. So I'm not going to reiterate everything he said, but splitting it so you're only putting a third out at planting because the nitrogen demand is so low, and then around V6 coming back in with 2/3. And what Sean was saying is that litter is such a great option, or biosolids if you can get your hands on them at planting, and then come back in with your commercial in mid-season. This is some data from last year from Dr. Adote, who's our soil fertility specialist, looking at a split application. This is just commercial in versus a single application. So you'll see the single application in the orange bars and split application with gray. As you get up over 120 pounds, you'll start to see that big difference in the yield. So we're having quite a bit of loss with that single application. When he came in with the split around V6, he hadn't lost as much when the crop actually needed it. So we see a big increase in yields with that. So placement, and this kind of gets back into the heart of what a lot of us think of when we think about precision application. So there's variability in all of our fields, really in Tennessee, across the state. So we can see that in yield maps. You can see on the left, we can see variability in topography, especially in Tennessee, soil fertility, soil electrical conductivity, soil maps. There's variability everywhere. So we can use the variable rate technologies to apply fertilizer and lime, also other inputs, but right now we're just talking about fertilizer, to put the right rate that you need in the correct place. So this increases our input use efficiency. If we're putting the fertilizer exactly where it's needed and not over applying in some areas and under applying in others, then we will increase that efficiency. So kind of how this works for anybody that's not familiar, there's two ways that we do variable rate. So the first is map based, and that's what most people do and think of when they think of variable rate. So basically we have a soil map, we have yield maps, whatever data we have, and I'll talk about some of that in a minute. We create a prescription for the field. So be it P or K, both, lime. We create this prescription on the computer. We load that into a controller. The controller will talk to the variable rate drive. So this works with solid, liquid, and we can vary the rate based on that. So we have a GPS on the tractor, and we know from the map what rate we need in that specific place. So that's how map-based variable rate works. Sensor-based variable rate, of course, not as many people are using this, and it's a lot more advanced, but we can put things like green seeker on the boom. So as we're going through the field, basically the sensor will give you a reading. We'll talk to the controller. There's an algorithm that will tell you how much nitrogen to put out right at that spot. So that's real-time sensor-based variable rate. So variable rate application requires us to know two things primarily: how much fertilizer we want to apply and where we want to place that fertilizer. To get there, we have to precision soil sample. So our recommendations, our blanket recommendation is 10 acres or less for a grid sample. So with precision, we kind of want to go smaller, depending on the level of variability in the field. So we can go down to 5 acres, 2.5 acres. There's grid point sampling, grid cell sampling, depending on how much variability is in the field and how much you want to capture in that grid. So primarily, most people are going to be using grid sampling to soil sample. Zone management is another style. If you have a lot of data, if you have a consultant that is good with GIS, that kind of thing. But basically, we find zones in the field that are similar to one another. I've got one down here, and then you go in this zone and you pull your soil samples from there to make a composite. And then you have your prescription based on these zones instead of the grids. So a lot of that is a little overwhelming if you're not familiar with it. Our model really in Tennessee and in the US is that a consultant or the retailer will come out, soil sample based on the grid size that you agree upon, so send that sample off to a lab. The lab will send back those results. That person can make the prescription for you, and that person can apply the fertilizer for you. Now, there are many people that do this themselves, but there are things out there if you wanted to try to do it yourself. So Soil Test Pro is one of those options. I just wanted to show you really quickly, and there's more out there, but they basically use a little map and they delineate their field boundary. They can change the grid size and shift it around. So, if they see an area that's not getting sampled, that they really want to be sampled, they can shift that map around. It will help you when you go out into the field to direct you where to go to pull that sample. And then it'll actually, this service helps you create your prescription. So there's many out there like this, but that is an option if you did not want to find a consultant or a retailer to help you. So talking about grid sizes, everybody wants to ask, what grid size should I be using? And the age-old answer is it depends. But we looked at a field at one of our research stations, and we wanted to see what the difference in fertilizer, the prescription would be based on sampling on a 2.5 acre and a 5 acre grid. So you can see those grids here and the difference in fine tuning that we had. So looking at, this is the P in this field. So we have the 2.5 acre on this left, and this whole area tested high. So according to UT recommendations, we would put out 0 P2O5 in this area. And then with a 5 acre, it was only this area that tested high. So you can see this is a lot more detailed with a 2.5 acre grid, as you'd expect. So that grid size saved us $3.42 an acre in DAP. And this was several years ago. So I'm going to just go ahead and say it'd probably be $8 this year in DAP savings. The same thing with potash. So it's a lot more detailed with a 2.5 acre grid sampling size, and $1.71 an acre savings in potash. So that would probably be $3 this year. So we're looking at $11 an acre we saved by reducing the grid size that we were using. I have several of these, so I'm going to set it up really quickly because many people want to say, okay, is it going to save me money? You know, we don't know unless we knew the variability in your field. You don't know the variability until you do the soil test. So this producer told me what their blanket rates were for these fields before they adopted variable rate application. So for this, for over here, we're looking at lime, and the blanket rate that he told me was 2,500 pounds an acre. And you can see in a lot of this field, you know, 700 to 1,800 pounds. And then in this area down here, you know, needed 3 tons. So again, you can think about how much could have been under or over applied in this field based off of his blanket rate. Potash is in the middle here. Again, this required 0. The stark red area, 220 pounds. And then this map, and these are based on UT recommendations, this map required mostly 0, except for those dark orange spots that needed 90 pounds of DAP. So all of those together, variable rate application saved this producer $13 an acre. So you'll have to check again with your co-op or your Helena or whoever you use to see what they're charging for the soil sampling, soil tests, preparation of the prescription and the application. But a lot of times we see lime and second to that, phosphorus will pay for that cost. The same thing here. So we're looking at, he said, you know, he put out a ton of lime, 200 pounds of potash, and 150 pounds of DAP were his old blanket rates. So in this field, he saved $12 an acre. And this is my last one, I think, and this was a little bit more to the extreme. Variable rate saved him $17 an acre. And again, you can see with the STAP application map, 0 needed most of this field and 120 pounds of DAP in that one spot. So my last section here is to talk about rate. That's the most fun to talk about. So land-grant universities in general, UT included, we follow a philosophy that we fertilize the crop. So we compare that to what people call a maintenance or a building fertility philosophy. So that's fertilizing the soil. So we're saying we want to put out fertilizer that is likely to get a yield response versus the maintenance and building philosophy is we want to increase the soil test to high and we want to keep it there. The risk with the sufficiency approach is that nutrients may be the limiting factor some years. The risk with the maintenance and building approach being there's no yield increase most years from the extra fertilizer application. So you can see in a year like this year, you know, you might want to consider the sufficiency approach versus building those soil levels. The benefit, of course, optimizing profit with the sufficiency approach, minimizing the potential for yield loss. So really minimizing risk is the benefit to the maintenance approach. And like I already mentioned, land grant recs are generally sufficiency, and I'll show you a chart here in a minute. A lot more retailers are recommending sufficiency approaches, especially this year. And generally commercial labs and retail recs want you to maintain and build. So we've sent off a bunch of samples over the years to different commercial labs. And obviously we have access to all the land grant university recommendations. So I wanted to pull those all together because it's easier for me to visualize in a graph than just to talk about it, and put words up on the slide. So this is for corn. We're looking at the P205 recommendations on the y-axis. Soil test P is on the x-axis. All of those green bars are different land grant universities. So I think I have 8 or 9 on there. They're all from the Southeast or Mid-South area. And the black is from a commercial lab that we use sometimes here in Tennessee. So you can see that they, especially with corn, our recommendations are all kind of similar, but you'll see the land grant recommendations using the sufficiency approach. When we get to 100 pounds soil test P, we drop off and we say, let's not put out any more fertilizer. We're going to re-soil test here in 2 to 3 years. If we have dropped down to a medium or low testing, then we up our application rates. Versus the maintenance and building approach is to come out here pretty far to 160 pounds of soil test P, and then put out a maintenance rate all the way up to over 300 pounds of soil test P. And then the same thing with soybeans here. You can see that the maintenance rate comes out a lot farther than what the universities generally recommend. So I took this out to one of our research stations and then across the state and wanted to compare these two. And I wanted to compare yields and compare the economics of this. So they're large scale strip trials. They're not small plot. And we set these up where we can control our road to prescription, we can control the fertilizer application on the field, and then we took a yield map in at the end and looked at the comparison there. So this is looking at yield, and I've included a variable rate application in here. I wasn't really going to discuss that because we didn't have any findings, but there's no yield difference with using the UT fertility recommendations versus a commercial recommendation or using variable rate in this field. We just did not have a lot of variability there. But when we look at the fertilizer cost per bushel, we start to see some differences. So here with corn, we can see a little bit of a difference. Beans is where we ended up seeing a big difference. So I have some more data from on farm, and this is Lincoln County. We did a trial down there for 3 years, and I was going to share, there's the yield map, the soybean yield data, looking at the land grant rec versus the commercial fertility rec. Our yields were not significantly different. And we look at fertilizer cost per acre. The land grant rec was down here at $10 an acre, and the commercial rec was up closer to $45, $50 an acre. So that's what we've kind of seen across all these trials, especially in beans. There is a big difference in the amount of fertilizer that we tend to recommend. Again, I know corn is of interest to this group. Corn yields in this other location, we did not see any yield difference, and we did not see much of a fertilizer cost difference either. Our corn recommendations track pretty closely with what we're seeing from local commercial labs. So my take-home message here with source, consider organic sources, especially this year. Nitrogen stabilizers to reduce volatilization. It's a good year to put out lime. It's a good year to soil test. Make sure you know what's out there and know what you've got before you start applying. And then winter cover crops, obviously for some added benefit there. Timing, split and delayed application. We have a lot of data in other crops that I didn't share, but with anything that requires nitrogen, we do a lot better to split it or at least delay it till when the crop needs it. With rate, sufficiency approach, I just inquire that you consider it. a lot of times people say, oh, I don't trust the UT recommendations, or or the vice versa. I don't trust the commercial recommendation. But there's nothing that says that you have to stick with one or the other. In years that fertilizer prices are high like they are, it makes sense. If you're leasing the ground and you don't want to build their soil test levels, then it makes sense. If you're in NRCS programs, then they require you to use the university recommendations. So those are some considerations there for rate. And then place. I didn't talk as much about subsurface application, but subsurface banding really helps. Precision soil sampling and variable rate application, it could potentially reduce your total fertilizer bill. So again, it's a really good year to soil test, to try it out, and hopefully reduce your bill some. Just like Sean, I know I'm out of time here, but here's my phone number and email address. If you have questions, then feel free to contact me, and I'll stick on the call tonight and answer some in the chat.
Thanks, Lori. If anyone throws it in real fast, we have time for one live question, and then the rest of them are going to have to go in the Q&A and the chat. Got like 2 seconds to ask your question while Aaron's pulling up his slides. Lori, can you stop sharing? Thanks, Ann. All right, they haven't asked, means no live questions. All right, Aaron, you ready?
You bet. Can you see my screen and hear me okay?
I can, and if you need to tag in your compadre, just let me know.
I will. I'll give all the hard questions to Charlie, particularly those that deal with livestock.
That's perfect.
All right. Well, I'm gonna jump right into this just with my take-home message. Fertilizer prices are likely to continue to be high in 2022. I guess one of the questions is, and this bodes into a bunch of different things that the previous presenters have talked about, but will prices moderate, come down, and when? We can think about this in terms of timing of fertilizer applications, but you can also potentially see another leg up on fertilizer prices. And so we'll go through some of the factors that are affecting fertilizer prices. That's really going to decide or guide where we go from where we're at right now. I think there's 2 important points that producers need to take home. The first one is the need to be thinking about profit maximizing decisions, not yield or price maximizing decisions. Those are very different things to end up looking at. Yes, yield is incredibly important. We don't want to sacrifice yield. I always say you can get your costs down to 0, but you won't like where your revenue is at that point either. So, when we're talking about this, what we want to look at is profit maximization. And the good news on this is prices have held up very well. Will that continue throughout the entire growing conditions? Well, there's a lot of uncertainty there, but I think we need to be more aggressive with the output price management tools, regardless of the ag industry that you're in. And a lot of this is because the cost of production has went up so much because of rising prices and general inflation. There's a lot more on the line. We're not talking about the same level invested into an individual crop or into a livestock enterprises. And so again, it's not just fertilizers. That's going to be the focus of my talk today, but land prices and rents are up. Crop protection products, they're all over the board. It was very challenging actually trying to get accurate pricing data across the entire state when we did our crop budgets. It was all over the map in terms of pricing. And then when we ended up looking at availability is a concern for many inputs. Machinery costs and labor shortages are up there. I do want to mention domestic trucking and logistics because there is a component here that is affecting fertilizer prices. Yes, the port delays have been well documented, but there is still movement across or within the United States. It is an issue as well. And when you think of trying to get trucks in and out of these ports, maybe they can drive for 11 hours. The problem is if they're stuck 4 hours waiting in line at a port, it really knocks down your efficiency. And so we'll talk a little bit about that. And then we'll kind of say, well, will prices be cheaper before they're needed in 2022? So jumping right into the global picture, I'm not going to dwell on this, but it is important to understand what's going on a global basis because it's going to dictate kind of fertilizer prices as we move through 2022 and into 2023. How quickly some of these issues get solved, get resolved, or get mediated is going to be very important to fertilizer prices. So we're looking at kind of current factors influencing global fertilizer prices, supply chain and logistical issues. I think that's been very well documented. across multiple industries. Current tariffs, there are tariffs on some fertilizer imports from Morocco and Russia. There's constrained foreign production in China. Some of that revolves around various different factors, but we do potentially foresee some easing of that as we move into the end of the first quarter into the second quarter of 2022. Domestic production, obviously we had hurricanes that disrupted production. We kind of have a hangover from that still. Natural gas prices I will talk about. I don't think that's a dominant factor in the rise in nitrogen fertilizer prices, but it is something where it does provide potentially some softening in nitrogen prices as we look further out. And then what's kind of really driving all of this is that increased global demand. And when you have high commodity prices, there's going to be more incentive for producers to plant, and that's not just in the US. And then another one that's obviously very important based on some of the key providers of fertilizers is the geopolitical stability. Obviously, when we're looking at Russia and China, they are big players in fertilizer markets and output markets. And unfortunately, they can politically throw a wrench into some issues. So the first one I'm just going to briefly touch on is supply chains. When supply chains are working well, they go unnoticed. But I think one of the longer questions that we're going to have to see or look and see how different industries and different sectors evaluate their supply chains is efficiency versus resiliency. And kind of what I mean by this is kind of the Walmart version where, what's the cheapest way to get good A to consumer B versus, is there a risk component there that we can end up hopefully looking at offsetting that long term. So providing resiliency if we do see continued disruptions for regardless of what the reason is. Another one that I think is important right now to consider is to kind of look back to the 2009 time period with the risk of owning inventory when prices run up. That's still going to be on the minds of a lot of people that purchased fertilizer at the retail and wholesale level. Just because there is a cost of holding on to that inventory. If you buy a whole bunch of high fertilizer prices and you don't end up being able to sell it at those high prices, then you get stuck holding some potential losses there. So that's going to be factored into how quickly we're able to move through this. So again, typically when we end up talking on the row crop side of things, we're talking about global exports of commodities, and the graph on the left-hand side shows how much of global production is exported in terms of share, and then the one on the right in blue is the percentage of fertilizer exports. So when we start looking at this, it's important to look at the difference between some of the different categories of nutrients, right? And so when we're looking at this, global trade is incredibly important to the direction of fertilizer prices. So small disruptions or large disruptions like we've seen have dramatic implications in how fertilizer moves. And so when we look at global producers, again, the US is not a major share of global production. When you go across the different categories, ammonia of 9%, phosphates 11%, potash less than 1%, and then urea 6%. But where you see substantial global producers is in China and Russia. And so when you look at these, and then Canada for potash, but you can see they represent a very large percentage of global fertilizer production. And that's why some of these geopolitical issues are incredibly important. Can we end up wrapping up or increasing our production? Absolutely, for sure. But we do have large players. And again, at any given point in time, there's a finite amount of any fertilizer. And so when we see constrained production, what we will see is a corresponding impact on the global market. And so again, this has been in the headlines in the news, is China curbing the exports of phosphate and urea. And you can see why it's important is China's about 25% of the phosphate market and 10% of urea. Now, we don't in the US get a lot of phosphate from China, but again, that phosphate is no longer on the global market. So they're seeking out other sources of production, which again is going to have impact on any available supplies that are on the global market. When we look at Russia exports, obviously it's all over the news right now, the issues with Russia and Ukraine. So that's going to be an important component to watch, not just only in grain markets, but also in fertilizer markets. And so when we end up looking at Russia, they participate in pretty much most of the the different fertilizer markets out there. So when we end up seeing taxes and quotas in terms of exports, that's going to have a constraining impact on global supplies. In terms of US, when we end up importing this, and these trade slides are courtesy of Dr. Andrew Muhammad in our department. If you haven't had a chance to meet Dr. Muhammad, he's our trade specialist. He does a fantastic job putting some of this data together. But you can take a look and see it's $6.25 billion is what we ended up importing for the different categories of fertilizers. Global container and freight rates been a big issue. You can see through the pandemic, we've seen an astronomical increase in the cost to move container freight from July in 2020 all the way up until we've kind of seen it starting to crest when we look at container freight rate. Now, when we look at the Baltic Dry Index, which is how we move a lot of our bulk commodities, we've actually pulled back a fair amount in terms of what that is costing. And so again, we do anticipate that hopefully this will continue. There was obviously some severe disruptions down in New Orleans that led to some of these spikes and in other areas. But we have seen kind of, I don't say return to normal, but we've seen prices come down when we look at bulk shipping rates. Now, when we look at actual domestic fertilizer prices, this is the one that I think a lot of people will be interested in. It's obviously very challenging. We track different fertilizer categories, both dry and liquid. But you can see compared to the same time last year, DAP's up 79%, MAP up 71%, potash up 119%, urea up 148%, anhydrous up 204%, and UAN 171 to 179. And so again, if you look at kind of the rapid increase, are we potentially seeing maybe a bit of a plateauing effect at the top of this? I think it's a little too early to end up telling, because you could end up seeing a plateau and then another leg up. But there is a reasonable case to be made that we might be seeing this market top in the first quarter. So when we look at this, natural gas is the key input for nitrogen fertilizer. So, you know, when we look at about 70 to 90% of the variable production cost for nitrogen fertilizers in natural gas, we have seen it come down from the peak, about 30% from the peak, but it's still up 59% compared to last year. And so when we look out longer term, lower natural gas prices should help with lowering nitrogen costs, but there's a lot more going on in terms of other moving parts that are affecting nitrogen and other fertilizer prices. And so there's a recent study that was put out by Texas A&M, and basically they indicated, and there's two charts on the left. One is the top one is the anhydrous ammonia and then natural gas price. And essentially what they're getting at is that the increased value in natural gas only accounted for about 15% of the increased cost in nitrogen fertilizer. And so again, when we look at this, you know, what they're attributing some of the price increases, increased nitrogen demand due to higher prices and increased planted acreage. And then they also have a component in there on the market power by nitrogen manufacturers by extracting profits from producers. So there's about four companies that end up providing about 75% of the concentration in nitrogen manufacturing for fertilizer. So the challenge is, and this is one where I do want to spend a little bit of time on this chart, is when you look at this is the price of, or the average monthly corn, wheat, and soybean prices in an index compared to USDA fertilizer prices. And one thing that's important to note is when you see fertilizer prices are usually lagging a little bit behind where prices peak. And so if we look at what prices are doing, you know, ideally what you want to avoid is to end up avoiding purchasing these high inputs and having commodity prices completely collapse, obviously squeezing margins. So when we end up looking at this, is there a lagged effect between the crop price and then when fertilizer prices potentially come down? So that's kind of where we're sitting at in terms of prices and what's going on. Well, so the question now is what we can do. And again, this is not an easy task. I think both Sean and Lori ended up doing great jobs with this. And I've seen this quote, right place, right time, and right amount to maximize returns. I think both Sean and Lori basically stated that. And so when we go through this soil testing, you know what you have. Sean did a great job with alternative nutrient sources. Lime and pH adjustment. That's one I'm not sure if that one was mentioned yet. Maybe I don't want to steal Dr. Aish's thunder on that, but that was one that Forbes Walker pointed out to me that's important to know, across a lot of different commodities, what our pH is at, so that we can end up hopefully getting the most of the nutrients that are available and applied. Variable rate application, Lori covered that one. And then again, trying to eliminate or reduce products that are not contributing to sufficient yield gains. When you're looking at alternative plans, if input availability is a potential issue, you'll want to have a plan A, B, or C if you can't end up getting what you typically would in a year. More of that's going to apply towards our crop protection products, not necessarily fertilizer, but it's good to have conversations with your fertilizer and crop protection providers, just so that you have an understanding of any issues that they may have in getting you what you need during the growing season. Crop rotation and species composition. I know there's been a lot made out between the corn and soybean trade-off between potentially having more soybean acres. I'm not necessarily convinced that we are going to end up seeing soybean acres rise substantially to corn compared to corn, because I think there is some relative profitability issues there that do end up favoring corn in several regions. And then also you end up having, sticking with your crop rotation is probably a pretty safe bet. Looking at crop share leases, I'm going to talk a little bit about that, and then obviously trying to get the maximum return to nitrogen. And then I want to close up with just some protect the output prices and manage the profit margin. And so when we look at crop share arrangements, if you're on a straight 1/4 share, and we have a fair amount of those arrangements throughout the states, obviously we've seen, or throughout the state, obviously we've seen some of these move towards cash rents. But when we have these high prices and strong yields, there's a lot more risk that is transferred to the producer from the landowner when we have high prices and high expenses. And so again, it's not an easy conversation to have with the landowner, but there has to be an understanding of who's bearing a lot of the risk in these crop share arrangements. So it might be something where there's a discussion about sharing some of the expenses or moving towards nothing but a straight cash rental rate. And so again, that's something that should be discussed if it hasn't already for the upcoming production year. When we're talking about maximum return to nitrogen, I just kind of want to highlight the difference that we're seeing in 2021 and 2022. And Lori did a good job talking about maintenance versus soil. And so again, when you look at the maximum return to nitrogen, this is the same tool that is available at Iowa State. You can plug in the nitrogen price and plug in the corn price, and it'll give you what the maximum return to nitrogen is in a range, right? And so one of the things that we've seen, this is again, I think one of the reasons why we see such a variation in recommendations, is when nitrogen prices are cheap, it's cheap insurance to make sure that you're not going to end up limiting yield. When nitrogen prices are high, maybe we need to end up considering, do we need to pull that back so that we're not over applying, but we're still getting sufficient nutrients to the crop at any time. So the one challenge that we do have is there's really not much to do in terms of managing input price risk. So we might need to focus on output price management. Trying to negotiate lower prices when there's availability issues, it can be incredibly challenging, if not impossible. So there are more risk management tools across all commodities that can be utilized to end up managing that output price risk and avoid that potential catastrophic set of circumstances where we buy inputs at very high prices and then we're subject to lower prices for selling our commodities. So when we look at corn, I'm going to use corn as an example. This can be utilized across multiple commodities. If we look where we're at right now, 559 on the futures for the December 2022 contract. And then when we look at last year, we're at 528. This is the average of the December contract from January to contract expiration. But what I really want to focus in on is the bottom, the blue bars, the min and the max range. I don't think we're going to see volatility exit a lot of the agricultural markets. And so we have to understand what is our risk that we're facing. And when we look at this, we look at our midpoint, and then we look at where we might potentially go using 2021's range of $2.06 movement. We don't necessarily know if it's going to be an upward move like 2021, or if we'll see a downward move, or we'll see a combination of the two. And so again, when we think about this from a producer standpoint, we are not as concerned about this top upward mobility as we are downside mobility when we're talking about buying all these fertilizers at higher prices. And so when we look at kind of a reasonable starting range, because there's a tremendous amount of uncertainty and volatility that are in a lot of agricultural markets right now. For corn prices, somewhere between 456 and 662 on the futures. Obviously, we have to adjust for our local or prevailing basis conditions. But again, this is just a starting point to end up looking at, okay, when we're looking at profitability outcomes, what are some of the likely outcomes that we end up seeing? And so when we look at basis for corn, obviously in Tennessee, we have very strong basis. We have very strong on-demand sales for corn that we can use to our advantage when we're doing price risk management. Lori mentioned what we end up having in terms of what's invested into a crop. And I think right below kind of highlights what we've seen: a year-over-year increase in expenses of corn up 31 to 39%, cotton up 21 to 27%, and soybeans up 18 to 29%. One other thing that I do want to point out, I mean, everybody's budget's going to be a little bit different. You can have corn grown on different fields that have dramatically different cost structures. The important point is to get down and find out how much you have invested in an individual crop so that you can make prudent risk management decisions. And so I mentioned there's some good news to this, and that's that commodity prices have remained relatively high. And so even if we have some very broad-based yield expectations, because we don't know what our final yields for 2022 are going to be, and we have high variability in prices, the good news is we do have the ability to potentially generate profitable outcomes given the current circumstances. The question is, will we end up seeing prices erode when we end up looking at it? So one of the ways that I kind of broke this down, and again, this is corn as an example, is how many bushels to cover a specified expense category. And so when we look at corn, for example, obviously there's a big difference in price, $565 in 2022 compared to the same time last year of $440. And so even with this elevated price, in order to cover fertilizer expense, according to our UT budget, what we would need is to have 56 bushels per acre to end up covering that cost, compared to 33 bushels in 2021. So when we look at that as an example, you take 500 acres of corn, 56.4 bushels per acre to cover fertilizer expense, looking at providing price protection on 28,000 bushels, or 32% of estimated production at the state average of 175 bushels per acre. And so again, one of the ones that we do need to avoid when we're using pricing strategies like this is avoiding exchange price risk for production risk. So pricing more than what we have in case we have a production disruption. The other one that I do want to point out is there's a big difference between price risk management and final cash sales. They're not always the same, and I'll use a very quick example of how to use an option contract to end up removing some of the price risk. And again, in Tennessee, we always want to account for our local market conditions when we're looking at the prices that are available to us. We look at risk management tools. Crop insurance is one of the primary safety nets that we end up having. Unfortunately, we don't have prices determined until the end of February. So again, there's still a fair amount of risk in there, but there's a whole host of other price risk management tools that we can end up using. I think right now options in the futures market is a great alternative to remove some of the downside price risk while maintaining that upward price mobility, because I think you can make a strong argument, particularly in row crops, that we are going to continue to have strong prices. But what we want to end up protecting against is if we do see a substantial disruption that will dramatically adversely affect row crop prices. And so I'm going to use this as just a very simple example. You could apply it for multiple commodities, but using a corn put option for the December contract. And I pulled these as of this morning. So right now you can buy a 5/30 December put option for 31 cents. It sets a $4.99 futures price floor. And so if you end up having December futures above 5/30, then the option has no intrinsic value. If it's below, then it does have intrinsic value. So when you're assuming a yield of 175 bushels per acre, what you're trying to do is remove some of this input cost risk. So if you have 950 bushels or $950 an acre. You're protecting 873 if yield is achieved. And so again, what you're doing is you're removing some of that output price risk that is affiliated with, you know, the revenue equation where we've got so much more invested into that crop. Now you can do this for a defined period of time. And so when you look at exiting that put option, I think there's very few circumstances when you want to carry a put option all the way to maturity. I think targeting price risk gaps or risk gaps where you can end up effectively using that tool to bridge a certain time interval and then being able to turn around and recouping a portion of that option premium. So in this case, we're looking at 31 cents. If you're holding it until crop insurance prices have been finalized, you're likely going to be able to recoup the majority of that premium. So again, identifying those price risk gaps, I think, are going to be very important in protecting output prices so that you don't get it that catastrophic margin squeeze where we see high input prices or fertilizer prices purchased, and then you see commodity prices come down substantially. So just in concluding, you know, prices are strong, but we're likely going to see a lot of volatility in commodity prices as we go into 2022. And there's a substantial amount of downside risk. There's a lot of uncertainty out there based on current global circumstances where you could make a valid argument that certain issues could end up dramatically affecting prices through our growing season. Ultimately, between now and when planting or input uses or when fertilizer is applied, we don't know if prices are going to be higher, the same, or lower. I think you can make a valid argument that we could end up seeing a potential softening in some of these prices. But again, there's a lot of balls in the air in terms of what's going on globally that can really affect these fertilizer prices. And so it's very unpredictable right now based on supply chain issues and geopolitical forces try to predict what's going on. So again, time is on your side in terms of depending on when you need inputs. If you've come this far without pricing any input or any fertilizer for 2022, you know, it might be valid to end up seeing where we end up going through the season, but there is a tremendous risk. If you have bought fertilizer and you haven't secured a price, then you have a lot of financial risk based on the higher value of the inputs that have been put in there. So again, the risk profile is very different and should be reflected in your risk management decisions and making sure that you use the available tools that are there. And again, inaction is a decision, but it's usually not the correct one. With that, I think I got us close to back on time, but I would entertain any questions if there are any.
Show off. Just kidding. Any questions for Aaron? Have time for a couple live. I always really like your presentations, Aaron. I learn a lot for a non-econ person.
Thank you. I'll turn it over to Dr. Aish and he can answer my pH question there.
Neil, you with us?
I am.
Perfect.
Are we there?
We see all your slides.
All right. Well, no, I got the wrong. Hold on here. I was on the wrong one. There we go. All right. Just a couple things here. I'm too old to be an expert. I didn't have a gray beard until Aaron started talking. But overall, this has been just a really informative group of presentations. One thing I will say on this whole thing with Lyme, I always tell I teach new research at UT. I'm not an extension person. So you're going to see some stuff I'm going to talk about on the presentation we gave. We were asked to give one to some DC staffers here a year or so ago on how can we move forward on the whole thing with making soils better. So this is part of that presentation. Lyme is really the cheapest place to start. You You know, you got to make sure your pH is right. As Lori said, it's soil test. Splitting these applications are a big deal. I still farm. You'll hear a little bit about me doing that later. But this information that we got so far has been just fantastic. So I'm gonna take us into the, I'm supposed to be this expert on soil health, and I'm not, but I know soil tilth and soil quality. That's kind of how I grew up. And so the idea is, how do we make soil health or soil quality or soil tilth better? And then the other thing is, we can do this and we can capture CO2 to make soil better. We're going to have to sequester some more carbon. And then the other issue is, how can we help adapt agriculture to intense weather patterns? And we'll deal with this with some definitions here. I'm going to start here with this one. I pulled this out of an old Ohio State Agriculture Extension Service bulletin in 1936. And this is what we see after we started plowing the prairies, is what they termed as exploitation. And then what we could have if we got theoretical yield expectations. And they're asking the question, where to next? Well, we know yields have increased. We've done just an incredible job with this through time. But the thing is, it's come at a cost. I don't think our soils are as good as they maybe could be. And one of the questions that's come through time is, how do we fix this? So there's some interesting things. I'm not gonna bore you here with this stuff. I'm gonna move through it pretty fast. But Freem in 1890 said, good tilth brings seeds, ill tilture weeds. Now, I like tilture, never heard that word before. Yoder in 37, he was down working in Alabama, said it'll be more economic to continue to use our soils in a poor state of tilth or promote the regeneration of a more desirable soil structure. So early on, it was all about structure, how the particles fit together, the void spaces, how you could get roots to move through soils and things like that. Then we got into 1959, and this comes straight out of a document in one of the USDA books. They identified the need to conduct basic research on the relation of physical, chemical nature of soils, the role of organic matter, the activities of microbes, and the effects of mechanical manipulation upon the structural attributes of soils, directed toward predicting the effects of soil management practices and providing an optimum environment for root growth of crops in different kinds of soil. So this all gets expanded. So that's kind of where tilth came out of. And then we went into soil quality. And this kind of came in because this whole issue of long-term tillage results in less soil quality. I was on a site once years ago in Africa where they're putting in a center pivot. In Africa, they buried the water lines 4 foot deep. Okay, they don't have any freeze there. So the question is, why? And the question that came back with is because we wanted to live for 20 years and the erosion will lose that much soil. And that was true. They were losing that much soil. So it's completely unsustainable. So we have to look at how we can make these soils better. Agronomy News defines soil quality back in the day as the capacity of a specific kind of soil to function within natural or managed ecosystem boundaries to sustain plant and animal productivity, maintain and enhance water and air quality, and support human health and habitation. This kind of goes back to what Lori was saying about water and air quality, sustain plant and animal productivity, and this whole thing about, there's even people that will go so far as to say that this whole issue of healthy soils make healthy people, which is interesting. Here's a good book for you guys, Cows Save the Planet by Judith Swartz. She sent me this book. I was doing some stuff and somehow I ran across her, and all of a sudden she says, I like what you do, and I got this book. It's an interesting book. I would recommend it to all of you. Maybe all of you have read it, but it looks at how we take care of pastures, how we graze cattle, what that can do to make soils better. So we get into the soil health thing. NRCS says soil health, also referred to as soil quality. So they're kind of a little afraid to get away from soil quality. It's defined as the capacity of a soil to function as a vital living ecosystem that sustains plants, animals, and humans. So yeah, there we are. Now today we're into regenerative ag. Now, this is a big deal because we have big businesses getting into this. At the end of this, I'm going to talk a little bit about carbon carbon contracts, stuff like that. I'm not going to do much. That's more Aaron stuff. But the thing is, it's interesting. Anyways, I'll keep going. Regenerative ag. At its core, regenerative ag is a holistic approach designed not just to sustain soils, but also to regenerate them, improving soil health as a central foundation. So this thing with soil health or regenerative ag is to make the whole thing better. Now, regenerative ag started when I was at grad school back in the late 80s. And actually, the first thing I saw in regenerative ag, it was something out of Australia where they put cow manure into cow horns and buried them under the right sign of the moon. And then they would mix this in a spray tank, make a tea, and they'd put this out, and that was how you got real good soils. So, I like this, what we're doing now, a lot better than that. But soil health starts with adopting regenerative practice that encourage abundance and diversity of soil microbes. I can't think of any reaction in soil that is not microbially mediated. They all are. So one of the things we have to have is a very active and vibrant and diverse microbial population. It is these soil microbes that drive processes resulting in a rich cascade of beneficial soil health and structure. The structure part comes from these microbes. Actually, my PhD dissertation was on fungal hyphae and how they hold pieces of soil together. And then you have the bacteria that will kind of glue stuff together. So this whole thing on structure affects including improved soil aggregation, water penetration, increased water retention, improved nutrient retention and availability to plants, decreased soil erosion, reduce agricultural runoff, increase CO2 capture from air, and sequester it in the soil. All these together promote more vigorous and productive crops while also regenerating rapidly depleted soils. These are not just ideals. They're right. These are things we can do. The cool part about this is that your most degraded soils are actually the ones that can sequester the most. So, and where are the most people going to be born in the next 20, 30 years? They're going to be born on the continent of Africa. Where are the worst soils in the world? On the continent of Africa. So this whole regenerative ag thing is a really, really big deal. Why does it matter? I'm going to segue here a little bit into some stuff with no-till and why it's important. I apologize. I got this stupid little cough. Apologize. We talk about no-till because if we can get 80% cover, ground cover, we can get that crop residue to cover 80% of the ground. I mean, let's go back the other way. Well, no-till, most of it is 80%, but the point is, if you can do 30% residue cover, you get an 80% reduction of erosion. If you have 80% ground cover, you have basically none. Now, I farm basically no-till up at home. I have a little trouble with slugs, and I'm always at the 80–90% residue cover, and there's just no erosion at all. But this thing with conservation compliance has to deal with the 30% residue cover because we can get an 80% reduction in erosion. Now, one of the things that's going on through time is that when we first started tilling soils, this comes out of some stuff by Black and Bauer back in the 40s. They published this, and they looked at the whole issue of what happens when we plow soils. So the tillage aerates the soil and results in a rapid loss of organic matter, and that gets exhausted out of the top of the soil as CO2. So this led us to a push in no-till soil management, putting crops in with no-till. We actually led the country for a long time in no-till. We led the world in that. There's been a little reversion back to more tillage. Part of it's because of weed control, as well as other little insects like bugs and slugs that I have issues with. But you keep the crop residue on the surface, you protect it from erosion, and you're going to stop erosion, and all of a sudden the soil will build up. Now, I also tell my students that if you don't have any ethics and you don't care, if you have a neighbor that's been no-till for a long time, rent that field and plow it. Till it up real good, and you're going to make a lot of money because that's going to hold in a lot of nutrients. So the point of this whole thing with this organic matter and its loss, the organic matter is such a reservoir of nutrients that you want that pool to get bigger through time. And then as you get bad years where you don't have quite the rainfall you think you should have, and you get a little bit of drought, that is where the higher soil organic matter levels will really pay off. So let's look at some of the policies and stuff that are out there. There's a lot of things on technical assisted applied research to make sustainable practices work for farmers. This is what we saw all over. We had a lot of strip till in parts of Tennessee, or contour strips. This was a big thing where I grew up in Ohio. There's contour strips everywhere. A lot of these have gone away. USDA ARS has done some work on this. NRCS has several programs to work with some of these things. And the idea is to support farmers using the best practices possible. Reward farmers for doing good things. We want sustainable soils. The current situation is this, that we can make these soils productive with fertilizers. We really can. We can make this work. But the problem with it is that if we keep losing the soil, it just becomes more expensive as time goes on. As the soils degrade, it's going to take more inputs, and more inputs end up being more costly. But you can make this all work. Now, the problem they have here are these rills that are going on because we see absolutely no residue cover. We got to have that residue cover after harvest so that we can protect the soils over the winters. Corn silage is one that needs a cover crop. You need some residue on the surface to stop what was going on. And this is a great quote here. Once we quit using fertilizer, we realized how bad our soils were. And that's really true. If you get the soils a little bit better, you can kind of get away with a little bit more, but a little bit less fertilizer. But I'm here to tell you, as a farmer, I've already got half of my corn fertilizer already on because I was afraid of the prices. I always spread out. I buy some in the fall and buy the rest of it in the spring. The problem, this is complex. USDA knows this. There's many factors that impact farmer choices and results. You got geography, climate, soils, all these things fit in. Tradition is a big thing. The economics is going to drive a lot of stuff this year. I always tell students that sustainability, well, in my household too, sustainability, for a farmer to be sustainable, he has to make enough money to farm next year. All right. And that's the whole thing. It's all about this year. So you have to make sure the economics are there and make the right choices. One of the things that we showed with them is what the impacts were on ag and grasslands. And the point is there's some stuff that we can do to make some changes. And I'm only going to do about half of this presentation. In the back of it, it's just littered with a whole, in the appendix, there's a whole bunch of supporting data on this if you want to look at any of this. But I'm going to kind of go through it kind of fast. And if there's questions, I think that's better. But one of the big things is grasslands are a big thing. We can, these are the top things if we want to look at climate solutions. We don't want grassland conversions. We want cover crops. The cover crops are a big deal. I don't care what you do for cover crops. On my farm, I don't like spending money on cover crops. So what I do is I put on half my corn fertilizer on the bean ground, and I throw in a half bushel of cereal rye, and I get it all mixed up, and it goes on in the fertilizer buggy. I spread it on. You'll see some of that later. It works really well for me, and it's enough biomass to make a difference. But you have to have the cover crops are a big deal if we want to see the soils get better through time. So it's just what we can make a big difference on this over time. There's some stuff out there on biochar and alley cropping. This is kind of hard to do. Biochar, you're just kind of spending energy somewhere to make stuff charred or letting it go through anaerobic pyrolysis and burying it. It is one good way to bury the carbon. Alley cropping was kind of in vogue back in the 80s and 90s, where you'd grow these alleys. And there were legumes that would drop leaves on for the crop as they break down. The problem is it's about the water. But what we see is just the solutions that are there. It's no-till, stop the tillage as much as possible, use cover crops. You keep something growing during the non-growing season, during the winter. Everybody likes it. You know, for me, it works. These cover crops, you combine them with reduced tillage. It's a good potential to mitigate climate change. You keep the plants growing as much as possible through the year with cover crops, and then you reduce the fallow over winter and allow in non-growing periods, you get it all green. Now, you can do this with the roller crimper if you want to, or you can plan into it. Now, what you'll find, at least what I found in the work we did some stuff at the organic farm several years ago, what we found is you had to have the lignin levels high enough in the grasses to bend them over if you're going to roll or crimp. Now, what I do on my farm is I just plant into it, and I'll show you that here in just a minute. But the thing is, if you're gonna make your soils better, you want to regenerate them. You're going to have to get rid of the tillage. Reduce the tillage, especially the no-till. You know, especially go to no-till if you can. So this is some of the work we did with a little no-till planter that a guy, John Morrison, that was a person, a faculty member in our department, an adjunct, that we worked on at some plots that we did up in Ohio. And we actually did some moldboard plowing up there, which I'm not proud of, but we actually did some just to look at and measure what the difference was between no-till and doing the tillage. But you got to keep the residue on the surface. And you can plan into this, you see the residue there later. Why is it important? One of the things, if you travel the world, you can go to places in Central America and they just use a planting stick. A dibble stick. They'll put a hole in the ground, move it, drop the seed. They're really good at it. And that's really pretty much no-till, and that's their history. They did not have the technology to till the fields. When tilling was developed, it dramatically increased the amount of food a farmer could grow because it eliminated competition from weeds. That's one of the things. The other things that it did was if you broke open some of these soils around here, as well as farther into the Midwest, as those soils were broken and plowed, the amount of nutrients that were left for the growing crop was just huge. And so you didn't have to do much. You could be very successful. And this is what it looks like when, in my half bushel of rye, when I plant through it, it works. I can even show you here. I got it in the play, I think. But it for me, this works. It's a 6-row planter. You got to kind of watch where you're going because it's just a little dent in the weeds is what you have to follow. But for me, it works. And you plant into it as long as it's dry. There's no problem with stuff wrapping. It'll actually. How do I make this go forward now? Come on. So one of the things is that tillage leaves the soil bare, makes it extremely vulnerable to erosion, which has led to worldwide soil degradation. Right here, this is a site in southeast Minnesota that's lush, windblown silt. This is one rainstorm that happened, and that's how much went out of there. This is some of the work I did in Africa, and this is over an inch of soil lost in 1 year. This is one rainfall event. This is one rainfall event. The point we have to have is that we have to keep soil covered. No-till is critical for soil health, sustainable ag, herbicides, cover crops that can reduce weeds without the need for tilling. Plant residues left on the surface with cover crops protect soil and help build soil organic matter, similar to what we did back a long time ago, but today we can do it at a scale that can feed today's population. That planting into that rye yielded me 215 bushels an acre across the scale on corn. I'll take that every day of the week. Current acceptance is no-till. A lot of people have adopted. There's been some disadoption again because of tillage, but you can see that we have quite a bit of tillage out in the lush areas of Tennessee, which is a really good thing. Cover crops, there's not a lot of adoption. It could be better. As I went across at Christmas, we drove out to see my son in Colorado, and I'm here to tell you there aren't many cover crops. I think I passed 6 fields going out there, and I don't know how many was it, 1,200 miles, which is pretty disillusioning. You know, I was hoping there'd be more. And then this is just some of the stuff, the work that we've done in parts of the world where we know that if you do the, if you put a wheat or a rye or something like that, if you're under 0, you have a negative number, it means you're sucking down CO2, you're sequestering carbon. These numbers are the same in Ohio, and they're also just pretty much the same as what we saw down in Loudon, Tennessee, as well as Lesotho. The numbers don't change much. Another thing that gets people to really change and make a difference here is the fact that farmers see the difference on one side of the road versus the other. I've heard testimonials, anecdotal evidence of this many times where farmers are conventional, the other side's no-till, and they just can't figure out what happened. For me, it's really fascinating. I farm, so I've been playing around with some stuff just to get rid of these slugs. And so I disced part of the farm last year, and then we went into harvest. This was in 20. It was a very, very wet fall. And so when we harvested, the wettest part of the farm was all no-till. The other part, I just disked it shallow. And when we went into harvest, the wettest part of the farm, we made no ruts. But where we'd done a little bit of disking, we were cutting ruts really bad. And I got to clean that up now with more. I got to fix the disking with more disking. And the combine guy, he got on there and said, "What is going on? Why is only half of that? That's pattern tiled on the part we're cutting the ruts." I said, "Talk to me about it. That's the tillage. That's what changes it." So the point is, we've had a lot of help with our research. USDA has been behind it. USAID, we're getting help from DuPont, Tate and Lyle. UTIA has been good. NOAA has been really helpful on the stuff we're doing. And what we're saying is it's pretty simple, and that is we just need to pay farmers some money, pay them with incentives, get the no-till going, and get the cover crops in, and then I think it will work. The problem with it is that a lot of the stuff going on with the carbon credits and the carbon swaps is that it's all going to overheads. So I'm working some stuff right now in Africa. I got 150,000 sites. I have 150,000 farmers where I know the GPS coordinates too, that we want to do some work with carbon payments. But everybody that talks to me, I get phone calls in, everybody that talks to me, they want to take 85% of the money for overheads to verify that this is getting done. And what they're going to measure with, it really isn't measurable. You have to take a sample before, you take a sample afterwards. Nothing else is really going to work. There we go. I've said this. CTIC, go on their site. They do a lot of good work, ctic.org, and they look at the whole issue of how much conservation tillage is going on, which is pretty interesting. And then the other thing is just reward people, get the farmers paid for taking care of the soil, pay them for doing no-till and cover crops, make it clear what they're going to do. That was our message to the people in DC, and I think it was pretty well received. But they still talk to us a lot. It kind of wants to come back, but I don't know. It just seems like a toxic place. So behind this, we have a lot of supporting data, highlights history, other stuff that we've done, stuff that's in here. So anyways, I'm gonna let it go with that. I'll turn it back to you. I guess I stop share, and I'm gonna be quiet now and take a drink of water.
Well, don't be too quiet, Neil. You've got some questions in the chat that I'm going to have us answer live. So one question here is the use of microbes. You touched on a little bit. Do you have any opinion on the use of microbes? And they're asking specifically because there are some that are commercially available for purchase. So are they worth the purchase?
So let me see if I can find that question. I didn't quite catch it.
Look at the Q&A. It's going to be next to the participants button.
How far down are we here? Okay, just ask it to me again. I'll see it. Ask it real quick. One more time. Tell me again, Liz.
So the question was, do you have any opinion on using microbes? I'm assuming as a soil amendment, because there are some commercially available for purchase.
Yeah, that's a really good question. The point is, I would, it's kind of like seeding for earthworms. If you don't have earthworms, quit tilling and the earthworms will come. For the nutrients, unless you're really, really in a bad place, typically the microbes will come. They'll do the degradation of the, if you get stuff growing, if you have a crop growing, you have the microbes there. Then you let them feed on the residues, and you'll be fine. As long as if you're getting a good yield, I wouldn't worry about the having microbes there.
As long as you're not in a bind, investing in microbes probably not your best option.
Yeah, no, it's unless it makes you feel better. But generally, no. It usually doesn't pay.
All right, next question on here is, will wide ripping of pastures help with nutrient incorporation and add to benefits of pasture growth?
Well, I wish I could see that question. I don't hear the best.
So look, Neil, look at the bottom of your screen. So you're going to see mute.
Yeah,
stop
no,
video,
I've got them all on here, but
participants.
I'm not seeing that one.
It's going to be the one all the way on the bottom. Go to open questions, not the chat, the Q&A.
Okay, all right.
You see it now?
No. Q&A, I got it. Will wide ripping of pastures help with nutrient add to benefits of pasture? Okay, on that, it depends what you're going to incorporate. Wide ripping. Okay, in general, unless you're putting on a lot of lime, there's really no need to incorporate lime. It'll move down with the rainfall. It'll move in. Most of your other nutrients will as well. Unless you're trying to get rid of another problem like truck tracks or a lot of compaction, you should not have to work the material in. Now, having said that, some of these materials will have enough odor with them that you probably want to try to work them in a little bit. Some of the poultry litter can be pretty strong, as well as some of the alternative nutrient sources that Sean was talking about.
Yeah, if I can, I want to comment on this briefly, if everybody can hear me. So this is not, I wouldn't say an unusual practice, but it is fairly common in some areas. Litter is incorporated when it's land applied, and the intent there is to cut down on the ammonia losses from the litter. And of course, as Neil is referencing here, that it's an odorant, and that could potentially help some with odorants. But my observation is that most of the alternative fertilizers that are organic typically don't have the ammonia concentration is typically just a minority of the total nitrogen content of the product. So let's say poultry litter, for example, 15% of the total nitrogen might be ammonia. So my comment on that would be is that your return, on that equipment and labor would be low, because the ammonia is a minority part of the total nitrogen in that product. And the same would be true for dairy waste and swine waste. Now, that being said, there's some biosolids that are available that are called lime amended biosolids, and the ammonia content of those can be extremely high. So that's the only case that I can think of where I would recommend that as a standard practice. But anytime you have a sod, I don't know what you think, Dr. Esch, but I mean, my tendency is that you don't want to disturb it. So I don't think that would be a good practice for these alternative fertilizers, just as a matter of course, to incorporate these organic fertilizers. It's not necessary in my observation. Remember, I showed quite a bit of information on the mixed grass sward plots at Greenville and Plateau. All of the fertilizer that we used there was surface applied, and we didn't incorporate any of it.
Yeah, I would second that. Most of this just doesn't have to be incorporated unless you're looking at an ammonia issue or an odor issue, and you have neighbors, or you live beside, or you're applying it next to the church right before a wedding, you probably want to incorporate that. But no, don't incorporate.
Thanks, guys. And Lori's added another question to the chat about PLFA tests. Are they useful for farmers or just a tool more for research? The agronomic recommendation on planting cover crops are pretty hard for most farmers in their area to meet for grain corn. Do you think it's worth pushing that planting date just to get the cover crop out there, even if it's not a great stand through the winter? That's in the chat, Neil. So to the Q&A.
PFLA, primary phospholipid fatty acid. I think they're more for research. The other thing is the agronomic recommendation on planting cover crops. I don't, so you have to understand, when I put out my cover crops, I've been having trouble with the haze from the wildfires out west. The stuff isn't ripening right. So when I'm throwing out my seed with my fertilizer, it's in late October. It's way later than what we want. In fact, the co-op lady even says maybe you don't want to put it on this year for the mix, put the rye in, but it seems to take off. So that's the thing. It's good to get you need that stuff out as early as you can. But I find it comes through the winter okay. But again, I'm just doing cereal rye. I'm not talking about any of the other stuff. Cereal rye is kind of bulletproof. It's kind of like a wheat. Is that the question you want me to have here?
Yeah, Neil, thanks. Lori, you have anything else to add?
No, I was just going to mention I do a lot of work in cotton. We don't get cotton out sometimes until late November. And so we've done work trying to establish vetch, rye, a lot of different things. And we've had some success. I mean, obviously we would rather get it out earlier. So with cotton, for example, we try to see if we can fly it in before we even pick the cotton sometimes. But yeah, I think it's an option.
Now we had another question that some other people wanted to chime in on, and that was, what are the main suggestions you have for producers who are growing their forages to feed livestock instead of selling crops? I think, Aaron, you and Charlie had some things you wanted to add to that. And for those who don't know him, Dr. Charlie Martinez is also in AREC, and you've probably seen him around the state. He tends to travel.
Well, I successfully interrogated y'all's a meeting tonight, so I'll consider that a win. But when I saw that, one of the key things that came to mind, it's a two-step process, right? I think Sean Hawkins did a good job of establishing that at the root, when you put a seed into the ground, you got to know what the soil that you're putting it into. I 100% agree with that. But whenever you put the seed into the ground, if you're feeding it for livestock or selling it, you have two different risk components there. So in my opinion, when you're raising it for livestock, what is the quality, what is the quantity, what is the cost associated with that seed, and then whenever you're feeding it, are you doing everything you can to manage the efficiency of that? If you're doing it for milk, for instance, are you doing everything you can to ensure the risk of that milk that you're producing from that feed? If you can think from a dairy instance, are you doing dairy DMC, dairy margin coverage? Are you doing dairy RP, revenue protection? If you're doing livestock, are you doing livestock revenue protection? That's the second step. And so for me, when I saw that, I was immediately thinking, well, we were talking about two different risk management points. And so I texted Aaron and was just like, that's a really complicated answer. And I think it depends. The good economist question or the good economist answer is it depends, right? So, but I think there's logical steps that we can take. And then we get to the crop side, say we're planting that seed and we're going to sell it for crops. I think there's a whole nother ball game there. And that's what I want to pass it back to Aaron Smith and say, let's talk about it then.
Yeah, Liz, and if the person that asked that question wants to reach out to us, I think we might be missing some context on that question, because there's a big difference between what you would do from an agronomic or soil science standpoint versus I would interpret that question as. And Charlie's right, you're looking at two very different risk profiles. First one is, are you managing your output price risk for your milk? And then on the flip side of that, you almost have to look at it more like an ethanol producer. Are you managing your inputs, which are the crops that you're planting, right? And so my big one, and I think if you're planting one of our four main row crops in Tennessee, crop insurance is an absolute must to have your risk, regardless of whether you plan on taking it off. There's other things that you can end up doing, but just pass along if you want some additional, provide a little additional context. I'd be happy to answer that. Yeah, but it does get quite operation specific depending on what she's looking at doing.
I think part of the question was also as far as applying fertilizer, since we're not necessarily going to be able to hedge our bets on selling a product potentially. Definitely, I agree. Investing in those risk management programs is really, really important. And I will brag on our dairy producers that they do a really good job of taking advantage of those programs. Just going to toot my own horn there. Not my fault, but just going to brag on them. But if there is anything else, I know Sean added soil testing. And I would kind of throw that out to Lori as well with talking about precision application. And she can feel free to correct me here in a minute, but my main thing would be soil testing, working with your county extension, and making sure you know what you need to put on and where to really minimize those additional costs that go along with that. And they all abandoned me. Thanks, Lori. I don't want to be a talking head by myself.
Yeah, no, I mean, that was A+. You are now adjunct in the best department.
Great. Love it. I'll take it.
This is Sean. I can't for some reason turn my video on. It keeps telling me that it won't let me. But one thing I just want to mention is in the research that I've done over the years, I've noticed that, when you cut forages short for nitrogen, it has a direct impact on I don't have any idea what.
I think that's my fault, Sean. I turned it off earlier. I didn't realize I took away all your permissions, but you can share your screen again now.
That's very interesting. I just wanted to mention that one thing that I've observed in with these grass plots and Bermuda and corn silage, that there's a direct correlation to the nitrogen, the crude protein content of those forages that are produced and the nitrogen application rate. So you do have to be really conscientious of your nitrogen application rate. There comes a point where you're hurting yourself more so than you're saving yourself the cost of that fertilizer. So be wary of that. I think Aaron had mentioned that earlier, and just thinking about, your corn grain. Yes, we want to be more modest this year in our nitrogen application rates, but you can't sell yourself short, of course, because it's going to have a detrimental impact, particularly if you're using those forages, to produce milk.
Thanks, guys. Sean, I'm still not sure why you're a talking black love. Sorry. We have a comment that came in to the panelists saying, for livestock producers in the fescue area, I personally suggest farmers need to consider stockpiling, especially this year. There is data that even without extra nitrogen, that it's worth it, plus rotational grazing in general. Any additional thoughts from the panel on that general comment? Needed Katie Mason. That's the piece we're missing from this. She could have talked about stockpiling all day. All right. Any other? Oh, Sean, I think you're muted. Are you trying to talk?
Those are good suggestions. Absolutely. I will say that in I presented a lot of research when I gave my presentation. I know I went very fast through that material, and so there's a lot of material there. One of the things I didn't present is we actually looked at whether or not we had a benefit for stockpiled fescue in the fall from a litter application in the spring. And I think it was 2 out of 6 years we did improve the crude protein content of the fall harvest for that fescue. So there is some modest benefit in using an alternative fertilizer in the spring. You have to remember that when we put that out, it is true that we have to be careful of how much is released during the crop year. But we can also take advantage of that with something like fescue that has 2 growing seasons. Some of that nitrogen is going to be released in the fall. So that's another reason that I like using these alternative fertilizers for fescue. When we come back into the fall and, when we get our fall growth, we do see some benefit in that. That's the only comment I wanted to make on that.
Thanks, Sean. Another comment that's what to everyone, hopefully y'all all saw it. Small beef producers don't have an option, either fertilizer, no forage, soil test with a question. John, can you add some more context for us? Sorry, it might be my brain not wrapping around it.
Did you say Sean?
No, it's a John Farrell online. If you
Oh.
could add some more context to your question, that would be great.
I would say this much on this. One of the concerns I have this year for farmers in general is that they're going to look at these fertilizer prices and they're going to not put on fertilizer. And I would put that even to the farmers who are grazing. I think you still need to make sure that you're going to have enough to get growth. I helped out a farmer this last year up home. He was in trouble, and some people asked me to help him out, and I just looked at what he was putting on, and I said, "There's one way out of this, and you're going to have to fertilize your way out of this. You're going to have to put some inputs in." And he put some inputs in, and things changed or turned around for him. But that's a concern I have this year. This past fall up at the co-op up home, the fertilizer buggies aren't moving. They're not putting stuff out because they're afraid of the prices. And I'm afraid of their economic viability the next year. I don't know if that answers your question, John, or not.
From the dairy side, have to do something or no forage and beef prices may not cover the cost. That's an excellent comment, John. And it's something that we've seen in the dairy world too, with high feed prices. It can be real tempting to cut that feed bill down and get rid of some of those high cost inputs. And then we'll see milk production crash. And the cost of that feed ends up being worth it in the long run to kind of maintain. I think it gets back to some of what Lori was talking about, spending a little bit more on the front end with precision. So you ended up spending less per acre. If it's possible to hedge, definitely hedge. Talk to your county agents. Unless you are a county agent, then call us. We'll chat more with you about what some of those options could be. And we're all here to provide as much stuff as possible. And yes, definitely soil testing and pH regulation. Big things, John. Thank you.
Yeah, I just like throwing your, John, you're right on the money. You got to get the soil. I see a lot of pastures around that have the that Tennessee Timothy out there, that sedge grass. That's a really good indicator plant for low pH. And you fix the pH, put some stuff out there and make it go. One thing I tell students when I teach soil fertility is you have to put a value on that hay that you're selling. There's a lot of nutrients going off the farm with that hay. And so keep that in mind. If you're not getting your manure back, there's a lot of stuff going away.
Any more questions? I know for me, this is my favorite part, chatting back and forth. I don't like hearing myself talk during presentation.
I know for cattle producers, I know there is a limitation to using futures and option markets, but LRP is one that is a possible consideration on there. There are some products that are out there to manage the output price risk, but you really have to know where you are in terms of what you've got invested into your pastures and what your expectation is for revenue, and then looking to see where you are profitable and where you're not. And then if you do get an opportunity to get output price protection, having the ability to pull the trigger on it.
All right, y'all. Well, it's after 9 o'clock by a bit here in the Eastern region, though it's creeping up after 8 for y'all in Central and West. So if we don't see any more comments here in the chat or the Q&A, we're going to go ahead and start wrapping up. Okay, I have another question. I have a cover crop that I'll be harvesting for silage, then planting corn. When is the best time to soil test?
When's the best time to soil test? Soil test as soon as you can.
Okay.
Just and don't hesitate. This last fall, when I saw the prices coming through on fertilizer, the first thing I did is I went and took it was pretty much a useless sample, but I took a random sample across the whole farm just to get an idea on what the pH was, to know if I needed to adjust pH, lime and adjust pH first, knowing that I need the most money I need the biggest bang out of the fertilizer I put out the next year. So that's the thing. I would just get the soil test, get it done. The comment Charles has here is a very good one as well. Don't deviate from good management practice. Don't let price move you away from good management practice, because I think it'll end up costing you in the long run. I don't know what Aaron says on that, but it'd be good to hear him. That's what, it's not non-economist, it's just someone with money in the game. That's what I would say.
I agree. I mean, good management practices are good management practices, right? I mean, yes, our cost and risk structure has changed, but it doesn't necessarily change how we should end up managing it.
Thanks for being here. Special thank you to our presenters for taking the time to do this at night. We really appreciate it. And I always learn a lot, and I hope y'all did too.